Recently, I had the chance to catch up with a friend from college. We got to talking about how our views have evolved since graduation, and we discovered that we both had come to view the culture of our university as highly problematic at best. That discussion has motivated me to share a few of the issues we discussed in order to shed light on problems within evangelical university culture. I also hope to reach others who have attended or are attending a similar university who may feel isolated in their acknowledgement of these problems. Those people need to know that there are others out there who see these problems as well. If that's you, you're not alone, you're not crazy, and you don't just see these problems because you have a prideful or unrepentant spirit. The school we attended was an evangelical Christian university. It was not a Bible college, but a full-fledged polytechnic university which placed evangelical Christianity at the center of its culture. I hope that you'll understand that I'm not naming the university here because I don't want any individual there to become a subject of public scorn. We had mandatory chapel 3 times per week, 5-minute devotions at the start of every class, and as a regular part of the admissions process, students had to sign a written statement that said they had accepted Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. Actually pretty standard stuff for an evangelical university. Now, as usual, I have some clarifications before we go any further. The ideas or beliefs I'll discuss here were not taught primarily by professors. These things were taught in our chapel services and were widely believed among the students already because it was an evangelical school. To my knowledge, many or most students in other evangelical schools believe these things as well. So this video is not meant as a critique of my specific university, but of evangelical university culture in general. Finally, this is not a critique of the professors or academic programming of my university. This video is about culture, not academics. Now on to the first belief I'll address. Closeness to God is necessary in order to maintain sexual purity. Obviously, the evangelical take on sex is that sex is permissible only within the context of a heterosexual marriage. So, at an evangelical university, just about everyone there wants to have sex, but most think that if they did, they'd not only commit a grave sin, but also possibly ruin their chance of a healthy or godly marriage in the future. Inevitably, though, most, if not all students acted on sexual urges in some way. By that, I don't mean to say that all students had sex, but rather that most made out with their significant other, engaged in what we called heavy petting, or just sometimes looked at sexually explicit material. Completely normal, healthy behavior for young adults. Boy, was it not seen as healthy, though. I mean, so many people at my school, myself included, suffered emotional breakdowns after having acted on a sexual urge, even though they hadn't gotten anywhere near having sex. And for those who actually did have sex before marriage, months, sometimes even years of emotional turmoil often followed. Most students' response to this turmoil was to pursue a closer relationship with God, who they hoped would give them the strength they needed to resist further temptation. There was a vicious cycle in play here. Students were expected to refrain from acting on normal sexual urges and were constantly encouraged to seek God in their lives in order to have His help in overcoming temptation. Then, when a student inevitably acted on their normal, healthy sexual urges even once, they'd feel an enormous sense of guilt and shame. Naturally, they'd spend extra time in devotional study and prayer where they'd resolve that what we're taught in chapel and church is correct. We're all too weak and unrighteous to live up to God's standards. The only solution is to seek God more fervently than ever before, or else relapse into sin, which could ruin our lives. By the way, if a student was not ashamed of their sexual activity, but the university staff found out about it, they'd be required to meet with chaplains or advisors who would tell them to repent and seek God, or risk academic suspension. Obviously, though, reading, believing, and teaching the Bible wouldn't stop anyone from having regular, healthy sexual needs for the same reason that reading, believing, and teaching the Bible does not stop anyone from feeling hungry. It's just a part of our biology. Eventually, most students would act on their sexual urges again, and the guilt would worsen because they worked so hard to prevent that from happening, only to learn that they're still incapable of living up to God's standards. This was a crushing blow to self-esteem, which usually motivated even further devotion to God. The cycle would repeat from there, often continuing for the rest of a student's time at the university. With each repetition of the cycle, students' self-esteem would decrease. I can't tell you how many people I knew who fell into self-hatred, who constantly called themselves weak and unworthy of love, who struggled with self-harm and even suicidal ideation just because they continued to have sexual needs even though they were a good Christian. Don't worry, though, many of us were told, because even though you aren't worthy of love, God still loves you, and that's where you can find your worth. This cycle creates dependence on this form of Christian ideology. It takes a fundamental human need and convinces you that meeting that need is morally wrong. Then, when you inevitably try to have that need met, this ideology blames you and insists that the only way to stop acting on that need is to embrace the ideology even harder. This cycle becomes identical to a typical abusive relationship when the student's self-worth is found primarily in God's love, since God's supposed word has gaslit the student into believing that their own healthy human needs are the source of the student's problems. Closeness to God does not enable sexual purity, and believing it does can be extremely psychologically damaging. Once out of my evangelical university, I, like many others, have come to understand the teaching of this piece of Christian ideology for what it actually is: abuse. We should stand firmly by our beliefs so that education doesn't weaken our faith, but strengthen it. From a Christian standpoint, this makes sense. The most important thing in life is to maintain a relationship with Christ. Everything else is secondary. This presents serious challenges to the process of higher education, though. The goal of higher education isn't to allow a person to maintain all the beliefs which they held before they began studying. It's quite the opposite, in fact. Higher education, in part, aims to teach us what our most reliable means of inquiry have revealed about reality. Inherent to that process lies challenge to and dismissal of ideas which do not withstand scrutiny. Like I said previously, we were required to attend chapel services complete with worship and a sermon 3 times per week, and we began every single class, no matter the subject, with a brief Bible study and prayer. As if that wasn't forcing a narrative enough, we were also given countless assignments in various classes that required us to write about how what we learned in class affected our Christian worldview. However, the writing prompts were not usually worded so neutrally. They usually went something like, "How did what you learned in this class strengthen your relationship with Christ?" When you're required to sign a statement of faith for admission, required to constantly attend religious services to remain enrolled, required to participate in devotionals in every class, and required to complete assignments where the answer you're supposed to give is included in the writing prompt, you're not in an environment which prioritizes education. You're in an environment which prioritizes the maintenance of specific beliefs over education. That's indoctrination. If a set of beliefs is true, it can withstand scrutiny from any and all angles. There's no reason to be concerned that our beliefs may be challenged throughout our education if our beliefs are true. Why then, at evangelical universities like mine, were the students and faculty alike so fixated on the idea that maintaining faith throughout a university education takes some kind of special care? The fact is, evangelicals know better than anyone that today, the majority of people who attended a Protestant church regularly as a teenager disassociate from the church when they reach college age. That is an understandably terrifying reality to them. Some may realize that this is because the facts of biology, history, archaeology, and psychology do not support a literalist Christian worldview. Evolution is real. There was no worldwide flood 4,000 years ago. There's no evidence that large numbers of Jews were ever slaves in Egypt. Oral traditions, like those which served as the basis for the 4 Gospels, are well understood to mutate dramatically over even brief periods of time, and supposedly supernatural experiences, psychologically and neurochemically identical to Christian experiences, both occur in other religions and have well-known environmental triggers. I don't think most people at these schools realize all of this, though. Honestly, I can't tell you precisely why there exists a seemingly unanimous consensus that Christian faith withstands scrutiny, but also requires constant maintenance within an educational environment. The closest thing to an explanation I have is that cognitive dissonance is powerful, and when it's reinforced literally every few hours, the idea that there's any conflict in this notion just disappears. Commitment to a belief, regardless of what you learn, is not an ideological strength. And when that commitment is required for the maintenance of a belief, it's a sign that the belief is dependent on the believer's ignorance. If you get close enough to Jesus, you can stop being gay. This belief is an extension of the idea that closeness to God can help a person maintain sexual purity. Of course, students at my university who experienced same-sex attraction usually entered into the same cycle of seeking God to suppress their sexual needs, eventually acting on their sexuality, then suffering emotional turmoil and repenting, only to have the cycle repeat. There was a distinction drawn between gay or bi students within this cycle and all others within this cycle, though. For most students, their sexual sin was thought only to be an issue of the context of their sexual activity. But for gay students, any of their sexual activity in any context at any point in their lives was sinful. There's a big difference there. Most students were just being told to wait until marriage. Once married, sexual sin would be easier to manage. Gay students, on the other hand, were told that their only options in avoiding sin were to either remain celibate for their entire lives, which included refraining from even having any sexual fantasies, by the way, or to seek God so fervently that he grants them the elusive ability to turn straight. While there was already greater stigma surrounding same-sex attraction and activity than there was surrounding other forms of so-called sin, the few gay students I knew who didn't go along with the idea that they could turn straight or remain permanently celibate experienced social ostracization and sometimes even disciplinary action. The real absurdity of all of this is that this academic institution's positions on sexual orientation were based solely on anecdotes and were not only unsupported by, but actively contradicted by the scientific data on the subject. That data is linked in the description for those interested. Oh, and my favorite response video I've probably ever done on my channel was a response to Frank Turek, a Christian evangelist, giving advice on how to respond to family members who have chosen the gay lifestyle. Yeah, he talks about God turning people straight, and I didn't take to that well, so go check that out if you're interested in that too. Countless times, the curriculum for my psychology degree at this university reinforced the idea that personal anecdotes, lacking any controls against confounding factors, served as less reliable data points than observations made within an experimentally controlled environment. Meanwhile, the university proudly ignored all research on sexual orientation in favor of the anecdotes of evangelists who claim to have turned straight by the grace of God. In fact, the university even had Christopher Yuan, a so-called ex-gay Christian evangelist, speak in one of our chapel services while I was there. He told us the story of how he found Jesus while he was in prison and subsequently stopped living as a gay man. We students were expected to see him as evidence for the claim that God can change our sexual orientation. Because, personal testimony is all we should need to believe that huge claim. However, during the Q&A which followed his presentation, a student asked a question which should have had an easy answer if God truly was in the business of turning people straight. The student asked, "Now that you've come to God, are you sexually attracted to women?" Christopher's answer, no. His answer had most of the audience looking around at each other in confusion. After several seconds of silence, he asked for the next question and just moved on. It was obvious, even with all of his talk of God's power over sin, the reality was that he had simply chosen to be celibate. So we at this academic institution were expected to forego any consideration of scientific research on sexual orientation in favor of a narrative which we were told was supported by anecdotes of great Christians, but was in reality still not supported by the experience of the most accomplished ex-gay evangelist to which we had access. The lesson of my reflections on all of this is that evangelical universities like the one I attended influence their students to purposely forego consideration of any information which could challenge their theological narrative, even though they teach within their own classrooms that cherry-picking data to support a favored conclusion is an anti-academic practice. The culture of these institutions asks students to maintain specific beliefs even when those specific beliefs prove not to have the utility they promise, even when practicing those beliefs hurts them, and even when they have no intellectual reason to accept those beliefs. Upon this realization, it's easy to see why these universities require students to engage in such constant, repetitive Christian rituals. Without perpetual reinforcement, their theological narrative might lose its grip on their students, just as the church is losing its grip on those who attend secular universities. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe and follow me on social media at the handles below. As always, if you're an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.